please state your name and affiliation. And,
Walker Williams with Leadership Africa USA. I have a question that sort of touches on what Gail said. We don't have $80 billion, but we do have some issues that are not closed. And I wonder if they're being considered by the administration. One, the reauthorization of AGOA. Two, passage of Electrify Africa Act through the Senate. And some follow-up on the U.S.-Africa Leadership Energy Summit in Addis last week, so that energy is a topic of discussion.
Thank you for the question, and thank you also for your work on the U.S.-Africa Energy Ministerial. Let me be a little bit clear on what I meant by, kind of throwing $80 billion out there, because we would take it if it was available. But a couple things. One is that one of the things we have been able to do, and Earl spoke to part of it, is use our assistance in a much smarter way. And part of that is because of what's happening in Africa. So that if you look at health, for example, the gains we're seeing come in part because African governments, a growing number of them, are putting their own domestic resources into the mix. So one thing is domestic resource investments are going up. The second is leveraging, some of it's private capital, but some of it is also the participation of institutions in the U.S., as Earl said, universities, NGOs, other partners. The third piece of this is I believe we have somewhere between 12 and 14 U.S. government agencies working on this summit. And a big change that I have seen being back in government this time is our ability to marshal, quite frankly, in a coherent way, an array of tools across the U.S. government. So that assistance is not the sole driver of what we are able to do. There are all kinds of resources we're able to deploy, but we're also able to deploy a dialogue that leads to reform. So you mentioned the U.S.-Africa Energy Ministerial. We held the first ministerial last week in Addis Ababa, led by our Secretary of Energy, the Ethiopian Ministry of Energy at the African Union. And what was extraordinary about that conference is that it was about the not most exciting sides of what Power Africa are. It's what does regulatory reform need to be? What does governance reform need to be? How do you work on standards? All those kinds of nuts and bolts that are critical. Nowhere in that discussion was it necessary to say, look, y'all really better reform. It was much more a dialogue about countries saying to country X, how did you do it? Or to saying to experts at the conference, what do we need to do to get more transparency in the extractive sector? And what difference does that make? So I think there's also a political dialogue that is embedded in this. As to AGOA and Electrify Africa, the President was very clear on AGOA when he was in Africa last summer and about our commitment to a seamless renewal. AGOA is, not surprisingly, very much on the minds of our African partners, and we are also very much in support of Electrify Africa. And I think on that, I would only say that, again, as a country, I think we've learned that when we come together and when we can have the executive branch and the legislative branch and both parties and government and our own civil society all pushing in the same direction, we get a pretty strong and, more importantly, sustainable outcome. So that's very much what we're going for. And there will be definitely follow-up to the ministerial. There's a meeting on that tomorrow to which you were not invited because you're not in the government. But we will report back. But we're on the case.